10 years had passed since John Smith had quietly packed away his old sorrows and made his way to a small house at the edge of Great Falls. Back then, he had believed he had found a place to finally settle down, a weathered wooden cabin, a backyard full of wild asters, and silent evenings spent wandering empty streets, letting old memories drift away with the wind. But life, like an unseen tide, has a way of reshaping everything without asking permission. Great Falls was no longer the sleepy town it once was. Glass towers clawed into the sky where old wooden rooftops used to huddle. Dusty gravel roads had become wide highways, buzzing with neon lights that never slept. Crowds surged along the sidewalks, engines roared night and day, and the air itself tasted of smoke and haste. At 69 years old, John Smith sat quietly on the sagging front porch of his cabin. His calloused hands cradled a chipped ceramic cup, long since gone cold. His faded eyes gazed out across a landscape he no longer recognized. Where children once played tag in gardens, there now stood gray concrete walls and endless parking lots. Night after night, the old nightmares returned. The crackle of gunfire, the frantic screams, the flash of explosions tearing through darkness. More than once, John awoke soaked in cold sweat, staring at the ceiling as if expecting it to collapse under an unseen bombardment. But it wasn't the war that hurt the most anymore. It was the deeper, quieter wounds left by family. Wounds no battlefield could match. The children he had sacrificed everything to protect had turned their backs, leaving him to cling to his own shadow as dusk crept into his days. Loneliness wasn't just an ache in his chest. It had become the very marrow in his bones, the silent echo in every footstep. One misty morning, before the first sliver of sunlight could pierce the fog, John Smith gathered his few remaining possessions. He stood at the door for a long time, one weathered hand resting on the cracked wood, as if trying to memorize the feel of this place for the last time. Then, slowly, he locked the door, slipped the key into an envelope marked, "For Hope's Garden Orphanage." No farewell parties, no tearful goodbyes, only the steady thud of a wooden crutch on cracked pavement, fading down the road as he walked away. John Smith, once a man who had refused to bow to bullets and chaos, now left quietly, asking nothing of the world he had once fought so fiercely to defend. He wasn't running, he wasn't fleeing, he was simply searching for something he had always belonged to. A place where the salty scent of the ocean filled the air, where the tides beat like a steady, familiar heart. A new chapter awaited him beyond the horizon, and this time he would live solely for himself. No expectations, no chains, no more wounds for others to inflict. Only the sea, the wind, and a battered heart that somehow, against all odds, still knew how to dream of freedom. The last bus rumbled into Port Haven, just as the sun dipped behind the distant hills. The whole town seemed to hold its breath under a dim, bluish sky with only a few streaks of dying light clinging to the horizon. John Smith stepped off the bus, his wooden crutch tapping hollowly against the gravel as he hoisted a worn backpack over one shoulder. Nobody paid him any mind, just as the ocean never asked for the stories of those who came seeking its shore. He rented a tiny, weathered house at the end of a dirt road, close enough to the water to smell the salt every time the breeze shifted. The house was a tired thing, with peeling white paint, a roof sagging under years of coastal storms and windows clouded by salt and time. But to John, it was a sanctuary. With what little savings he had left, he bought a small plot of land behind the house, dry, stubborn soil clinging to rocks and stubborn weeds. Yet when John pressed the first shovel into the ground, despite the stabbing pain from his old wound, He felt something soft stir inside him, like a spring bubbling up from under a parched desert. On days when the sun shone bright and steady, John built a boat with his own 2 hands. Not a grand ship, not even a fisherman's proud vessel, just a simple craft, sturdy enough for one old man and the faded dreams he carried with him. He christened it Hope's Echo. Every morning before the village stirred, John pushed his little boat out into the glassy waters. He cast his nets, baited his lines, and let the rhythm of the waves carry him, a rhythm older and truer than any he'd ever known. Some days he came back with a few plump red snappers or silver mullets wriggling in his nets. He would then hobble down to the open-air market and quietly sell his catch. At first, the townsfolk of Port Haven regarded him with wary glances. Another drifter with too many shadows clinging to his steps. But there was something about John's quiet patience, his steady gaze, his worn hands offering fish without haggling or hurry, that slowly thawed their reserve. One crisp morning, while John was laying out his catch, he noticed a skinny boy with wild brown hair lurking at the edge of the market. The boy's clothes were threadbare, his eyes wide with both hunger and shame. John crooked a finger toward him. "You want to learn to fish, kid?" he asked, his voice gravelly but not unkind. The boy hesitated, then nodded. His name was Evan, a stray blown in by hard luck and softer hearts. John saw something of himself in Evan's defiant, hopeful stare, something that refused to surrender even when the world had turned cold. Without another word, John handed him a small fish, ruffled his hair awkwardly, and from that day on, Evan became a fixture at John's side. On weekends, the boy followed him onto the water, learning to tie knots, set lines, read the moods of the sea. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, amidst the scent of salt and the creak of worn wood, John Smith began to rebuild something he had long thought lost: trust in life, trust in tomorrow. That summer, Port Haven swelled with a kind of restlessness. Tourists flooded the town, bringing with them the frantic energy of the cities they came from, an energy that seeped into every quiet corner, into the very bones of the place. John Smith kept to his rhythm, steadfast against the changing tides. Each morning he launched Hope's Echo into the calm waters, casting his nets, letting the ocean carry the weight he no longer wished to bear. One morning in August, the sea lay flat and gleaming under a cloudless sky. John was drifting quietly, lines set, his body swaying gently with the boat, when the roar of an engine shattered the peace. A massive white yacht, gleaming like a shard of glass under the sun, sped recklessly across the bay, slicing through the water as if the world belonged to it. John waved his arms. He hoisted a red signal flag as high as he could. But the thumping bass of music, the shrieks of laughter from the yacht's upper decks, drowned out everything. They didn't see him, or worse, they didn't care. The last thing John saw before impact was a wall of white metal bearing down. Crash! The yacht slammed into Hope's Echo, splintering the old wooden hull like a twig under a boot. John was hurled into the water, the shock knocking the breath from his lungs. Above, the laughter didn't stop. The yacht circled lazily once, then roared away, leaving behind a frothing wake and a wrecked life struggling to stay afloat. John clawed through the water, the heavy weight of his prosthetic leg pulling him under. He reached desperately for his floating crutch, for anything to hold on to as salt water stung his eyes and filled his mouth. Somehow, through sheer will, he made it back to the beach, battered, bleeding, half drowned. The crowd that had gathered on the shore didn't move. They simply stared, some with mild curiosity, others with thinly veiled disgust, as the old man dragged himself across the sand. No one offered a hand. No one knelt to help. A few pulled out their phones to film, amused by the spectacle of a broken man washed up at their feet. An officer finally arrived, young, stiff-backed, uninterested. He scribbled notes mechanically, barely looking at John. If there was pity in his voice, it was buried under layers of bureaucracy as he muttered, "You'll need to handle this with the insurance companies." Meanwhile, the yacht's owner, some young mogul from the city, hired a fleet of lawyers and issued a counterclaim that John Smith, an elderly individual with impaired motor skills, had recklessly endangered their vessel. Not only had John lost his boat, the last tether to his livelihood, he now faced the possibility of being sued into oblivion. That night, John sat alone on the crumbling steps of his tiny house. His arm, wrapped in a hasty bandage, throbbed with every heartbeat. The old crutch lay snapped in two beside him, a mute casualty of the day. Above him the moon hung low and pale, casting a thin silver sheet across the restless sea. John picked up his faded cap, dusted it off, and placed it gently back on his head. An old habit from the days when ceremony still meant something. In his chest, where once a soldier's pride had burned, there was only a heavy, gnawing emptiness. He tilted his head back, staring at the indifferent stars, and let one ragged thought settle deep into his bones. All these years, and for what? The ocean sighed, the wind howled softly against the eaves, and John Smith, the old warrior, sat silent, not defeated, but hollowed out, worn thin by a world that no longer knew what to do with men like him. The video spread through local social media like a small, cruel wildfire. A grainy clip of an old man thrashing in the water, dragging himself across the sand, a snapped crutch bobbing behind him like a lost limb. At first, it was just another passing moment in a world too crowded with noise. A spectacle for strangers to shake their heads at before scrolling on. But somewhere, someone stopped scrolling. In a large, polished office in Washington, D.C., a man in full naval uniform paused the video. He leaned forward, narrowing his eyes at the face on the screen. Rear Admiral Ethan Caldwell knew that face. Older now, more worn, but unmistakable. The way the old man hoisted himself upright despite the pain. The way he adjusted a battered ball cap with a certain stubborn grace. Memory surged, vivid and undeniable. Ethan closed his eyes and was back there. That night off the coast of Aden, when a patrol boat took fire and young sailors screamed for help as flames engulfed the deck. When the situation seemed hopeless, one man, already wounded, had plunged into the black water, pulling bodies out one by one. That man had dragged Ethan Caldwell himself out of the abyss. That man had taken a bullet through the knee to do it. His name? John Smith. Ethan opened his eyes, cold steel settling into his spine. Without hesitation, he summoned his aides. His voice was low but carved from iron. Find everything you can about John Smith. Where he is, how he's living. I want to know everything, now. Within 24 hours, a thick file landed on Ethan's desk. John Smith, the man who had once carried the weight of other men's survival on his broken back, was now barely surviving himself. No medals displayed, no parades, no safety net, just a weathered crutch, a battered boat, and a town that had turned its face away. Ethan sat back heavily in his chair, shame burning deep in his chest. Not just personal shame, but the shame of a system that forgot its warriors the moment their battles ended. Under the muted light of his office lamp, Ethan penned a letter by hand. To John Smith, the man who once pulled me from the jaws of death. I, Rear Admiral Ethan Caldwell, owe you a debt I can never repay. I promise you now, sir, you will not be forgotten again. At dawn the next morning, a special detachment left the naval base, carrying with them a crisply folded American flag, a silver star medal boxed in velvet, and a signed commendation naming John Smith as the unnamed guardian of freedom and dignity. There would be no fanfare, no media circus, just a solemn march to reclaim the honor that should have never been taken from him. That morning, Port Haven woke up just like any other. The cafes along the docks lifted their shutters, the smell of fresh bread drifted onto the streets, and children chased seagulls along the sidewalks, their laughter blending with the rolling waves. No one noticed the first deep, solemn horn echoing over the bay. It wasn't until the second blast, long and mournful, that the town truly stirred. Out on the horizon, 6 massive ships loomed, cutting through the mist like gray phantoms. U.S. Navy destroyers, their flags snapping in the breeze, lined up in perfect formation, headed straight for the harbor. The townspeople poured into the streets, onto balconies and rooftops, squinting into the bright morning sun. Phones were raised. Whispers swirled through the crowd. Something was happening, something big. John Smith sat on the worn steps of his little house, his battered crutch leaning against the railing, his cap pulled low over his weathered brow. He heard the horns, he saw the ships, but he stayed seated, unmoved. After a lifetime of broken promises and empty ceremonies, John had no more use for grand shows. He simply adjusted his cap, a soldier's habit he never could quite shake, and waited. When the dark green military jeep pulled up in front of his house, when the uniformed men stepped out, crisp and solemn under the rising sun, John Smith merely rose slowly to his feet, his body protesting every old wound, his spine straightening out of sheer instinct. A young officer approached, Colonel Ryan Matthews, his face grave, his salute sharp. "Mr. John Smith," he said, his voice carrying the weight of something long overdue, "we are here on behalf of the United States Navy." John looked into the young man's eyes and saw no pity there, only respect. Colonel Matthews opened a velvet-lined box, revealing the gleaming silver star. His voice, steady and sure, rang out across the hushed street. "For acts of extraordinary bravery and sacrifice, for preserving life and upholding the highest ideals of honor and freedom, we hereby present to John Smith the silver star and the everlasting gratitude of a nation." He handed John the medal, and then, with careful reverence, a folded American flag, the same kind that draped the coffins of the fallen. There were no clapping hands, no cheering crowds, only the soft rustle of the flag in the breeze, the faint slap of waves against the dock. And it was enough. Later that afternoon, the town gathered at the small coastal park. In a corner overlooking the endless sea, workers had erected a simple granite monument. Carved into its surface were the words, "John Smith, guardian of the seas, keeper of the silent watch." The townspeople filed past one by one, laying their hands gently against the cool stone, some whispering prayers, others only bowing their heads in silence. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves, asking, "Who was he?" And the parents answered, their voices softer now, heavy with the weight of understanding. "He was the man who kept the world safe, even when no one was watching." John Smith sat on a bench nearby, his cap resting on his knee, his crutch standing beside him like an old friend. Beside him sat Evan, no longer a scrappy boy, but a young man strong and sure. Evan gripped John's hand tightly, saying nothing. He didn't need to. Everything that mattered was in that touch. The gratitude, the reverence, the silent promise that this legacy would never be forgotten. John Smith, once lost to time, had been found again, not through noise or spectacle, but through the quiet, enduring truth of a life lived for others. Life in Port Haven slowed back to its quiet rhythm. Gone were the roaring yachts and careless tourists. Gone was the indifference that had once stained the town's shores. All that remained was the ocean, the steady whisper of the tides and the people who now understood that true greatness often walked quietly among them. John Smith politely refused every invitation that followed. No television interviews, no trips to Washington, no book deals or documentary crews. He asked for only one thing: let me stay by the sea. And so they did. Each morning John made his way down the familiar sandy path, his crutch tapping a slow, even beat. He would stop by the water's edge, lift his face into the salty breeze, and simply breathe. Some days he would sit by the harbor, watching as Evan, no longer a boy, but a man, guided the small fishing boat out into the open water. The same boat John had once built by hand, now lovingly repaired and renamed Guardian's Spirit. Every time the sail caught the wind and the boat leaned into the swell, John's heart lifted with it, carried farther and freer than his body could ever go again. He had passed something on, not medals, not speeches, but something far more lasting, a way of being, a spirit that did not break even when battered and forgotten. One late afternoon, as the autumn light faded into gold and the sea turned to molten silver, John Smith took his final walk down to the park. He sat alone on the worn stone bench beside his own simple memorial, the battered cap resting beside him, the crutch leaning faithfully at his side. The wind tugged gently at his jacket. The world softened at the edges. John closed his eyes. No gunfire, no betrayal, no bitterness, only peace. A young child passing by tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mommy, who's that?" she asked, her voice a soft flutter against the hush of evening. The mother knelt beside her and whispered, "That's the man who kept the ocean safe for all of us, even when no one else saw." And so, under a sky heavy with stars and the lullaby of the tide, John Smith, the guardian of the seas, the silent watchman of dignity and sacrifice, laid down his burdens at last. No trumpets, no grand farewells, just the endless embrace of the waves, the quiet honor of a life lived true, and a legacy carried forward in the hearts of those he left behind.